Okay, so Hancock's study is looking at psychopaths and the language that is used by those psychopaths. So can we establish that there are differences in that when we compare people who are classified as psychopaths to those who are not? So first we need to look at the relationship between language and thought. So essentially there's quite a bit of debate among psychologists and also philosophers in relation to how like language and thought relate to one another, or if they do relate to one another at all. But essentially, wherever you stand in that debate, you fit into one of these four broad categories. So either you think that thought is dependent on or caused by language. So in other words, the language comes first and the thought is because of the language used. That language is dependent on and reflects thoughts, so the language comes as a result of your thoughts. Or that language and thoughts are separate, so they're not actually related to each other. And finally, that language and thought are the same. It's also important to notice that when you do analyse people's language, there does seem to be apparent differences depending upon the kind of word choice that they might demonstrate. So like the choices over what types of words they use, what type of adjectives and stuff like that they might use, and their cognitive and emotional processes. So depending on your cognitive and emotional processes, you might kind of demonstrate a different word pattern or different word choices if you have those kind of abnormal processes. And even quantitative word counts can be used as a tool in identification and examination of these abnormal psychological processes. So actually psychopathy might be reflected in language style, linguistic styles. So psychopaths generally are said to have specific combinations of cognitive, social, and emotional characteristics that differentiate them from the general public. So actually, if we're saying these underlying cognitive and emotional processes are revealed through word pattern choice, are we going to see that psychopaths use different languages, or different kind of language use rather than languages, different language use to people who are not psychopaths? So what I want you to do first of all is to just take a moment here and think about what you think of when you think of psychopath. So what I'd like you to do is just make a note in your books what you think a psychopath is. It could be keywords, it could be imagery, and it could be things that you think a psychopath might do, so behaviours that they might show, anything. Okay, so pause the video here and just have a go at that. So actually we can define psychopathy as the below. So psychopathy is defined as a mental disorder in which an individual manifests a moral and antisocial behaviour, shows a lack of ability to love or establish meaningful personal relationships, expresses egocentricity. So in other words, kind of they're the centre of the universe and it revolves around them, and everything that they do has to bring benefit to them. It demonstrates a failure to learn from experience and other behaviours associated with the condition. However, in spite of appearing to have little or no conscience, they exhibit no apparent problems with intellect. So actually people who are psychopaths generally are fairly kind of intelligent most of the time. So there's no kind of problems with their intellect. They're more kind of kind of cognitive and emotional deficits. So there's two videos here. You have been supplied with the PowerPoint, so you can just click on those from the PowerPoint and go and watch them. So please watch those and make some notes on them. So one is on the traits of a psychopath and another is quite an interesting one on what makes somebody a psychopath. So pause this video here and just go and watch those. It's worthwhile saying at this point as well that Lots of students, when I teach this topic, tend to ask me what the difference between psychopaths and sociopaths is. So they are different. So psychopaths tend to be quite manipulative. They're often seen by others as being quite charming. They seem to appear to lead quite a normal life, and they minimise risk in criminal activities. So just because you're a psychopath does not usually mean that you are a criminal. However, sociopaths tend to be more erratic, they are more prone to rage, and less able to lead that kind of average normal life. So psychopaths don't kind of have, they're more kind of cold and calculated, whereas sociopaths may be more kind of risk-taking and erratic. And it's also worth noting that actually approximately 1% of the general population are psychopaths, according to some researchers. If you are interested, just generally interested in this topic, I just thought I'd make a note here of other stuff that you can have a look at. So there is some quizzes on Channel 4 that you can have a go at. If you click this picture, just like that in the slides, it will take you to a YouTube documentary, or you can just type that in. So real life psychopaths, it's called. This is quite a good book on psychopathy, and this is obviously a dramatisation, but this is Mindhunter, which is looking at criminal profiling and the dramatisation of that on Netflix. But they do interview a few people who have been, kind of associated with psychopathy. So it is focusing on like serial killers. So remember, not all serial killers are psychopaths, and not all psychopaths are serial killers, as 1% of the population are psychopaths. But quite a few of the people that they do look at are people who have been associated with psychopathy. So yeah, if you're interested in this topic, any of those things might be good things for you to do in your spare time. Now, in terms of the background for this study, when we have looked at language used by psychiatric patients, then actually they have shown that because of their differing cognitive functions, their language is affected in terms of the fact that they use fewer words relating to being optimistic, fewer references to the future, and less language use in relation to communicating with other people when we compare them to just a kind of a different sample, a control group. Now, there's not very much examination of speech when it comes to psychopaths. Now, Hare found that when you study the physiology, neurology, and behaviour of psychopaths, they seem to exhibit a wholly selfish orientation and a profound emotional deficit. And it could be that that is due to biological reasons. So, a couple more researchers have looked at the fact that psychopaths appear to have a diminished capability for neural sensibility, in the sense that actually they have reduced grey matter in some areas. So the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe appear to have reduced grey matter. Okay. So, previous research has revealed that psychopaths' language appears to be a little bit less cohesive, and by cohesive we mean kind of clear, structured, and makes sense than non-psychopaths. So there's 3 pieces of research here, but it appears that the discourse of psychopaths was more likely to include tangential and incoherent quality. So by this we mean they go off on a tangent, and incoherent quality in terms of some of the things that they say don't don't seem to make sense with each other, so they might contradict each other. Williamson found that when looking at psychopaths and non-psychopaths, the psychopaths tend to use more contradictory and logically inconsistent statements, and other research has shown that they use fewer cohesive ties, but use more kind of integrated details. So there are some studies that have shown some differences, but actually Hancock's study wants to do this in a bit more detail. So Hancock's aim was to examine whether the language of psychopaths reflected an instrumental or predatory worldview, so their cognitive differences, unique socio-emotional needs, and a poverty of affect. Okay, if you want to find out more about any of those things, then you can find these in the original study, but I will give you a little bit more information about these things that they kind of break this up into. So the first piece of research to really examine specific qualities of psychopathic language using kind of sophisticated analysis tools was Hancock's research. And the three main characteristics that they looked at was the instrumental nature of the language used, the unique material and socio-emotional needs evidenced in the language, and the emotional deficit evidenced in the language. I will explain each of those and the predictions made. So, the first one, looking at the instrumental nature. Instrumental nature is what psychopaths actually act like, quite naturally act like. So, psychopaths usually appear to view the world and the others as theirs for the taking. So, like I said earlier on, they view things in quite an egocentric way. So, the world revolves around them, things are theirs for the taking. So in relation to this characteristic, the hypothesis that Hancock had was that they would use more subordinating conjunctions in their speech, and they are words that kind of link to explanations or impact. So things like because, since, so that, due to this, stuff like that. Now, this was because he suggested that they would use more explanatory language, as though what they did was premeditated, it was meant to happen, it happened that way on purpose, basically. It was planned out. Their unique material and socio-emotional needs. So for psychopaths, it is usually the case where satisfying predatory basic needs such as sex, food, and water is more important to them than higher order needs such as family and spirituality and like meditation, relationships, self-esteem, all those kind of things. So Hancock therefore hypothesized that they would make more references to the basic needs of things like food, water, shelter, clothing, even things like sexual drive, more than they would refer to things like relationships and emotional connections. And the last one, their emotional deficit. So psychopaths exhibit a generalized deficit in their ability to experience emotions themselves and recognize the emotions that other people are feeling. So hypotheses for this was that Hancock thought that they would use more disfluencies in speech, so things like ums, as, stuff like that. They would use more past tense because they were trying to distance themselves from their crime. So that would kind of, I suppose, stop them from needing to address any emotions relating to their crime if they were distanced from it. And a higher rate of articles. So these would be things like there's and as and that's. So as opposed to saying him, you might say the guy. Okay, so you're labeling him as an object rather than as a person. So this study used a semi-structured, open-ended interview. So it was a self-report method, and it employed a technique called the stepwise interview technique. You need to know what that is. So there is a bit of an explanation. So it's an interview technique that is investigative. So it encourages and facilitates the recall of events. So it's done by beginning with kind of a very general open phase, and then it kind of narrows down using questioning where required. So the less prompting, the better. So the interviewer must demonstrate patience and allow as much of the interview content as possible to come from the participant. So it's very much led by the participant, and the interviewer is kind of there to just kind of funnel down into the details should they need to. So we use this technique to gather data in relation to the language of psychopaths and non-psychopaths who had committed murder. So this can also be classified arguably as a quasi-experiment, because we are classifying people as psychopaths, which is naturally occurring, and comparing their language to those of non-psychopaths. So these narratives from the interviews were transcribed and analysed through a content analysis using two techniques, the W matrix and the DAL, which we will explain later on. So the sample was 52 male murderers. Okay, now 14 of those are classified as psychopaths and 38 are not psychopaths. These are all incarcerated, so in other words, they are in prison for their crime, and it is all from Canadian correctional facilities. They had all admitted to their crime and they had all volunteered for the study. So 8 of these convictions were for what you call first-degree murder. So first-degree murder requires that a defendant kind of plans out and intentionally carries out the killing. 32 of these convictions were for second-degree murder. So that requires that the killing was intentional or reckless, so they've not necessarily planned it out, but that killing was intentional. And then finally you have got 10 of those as manslaughter, which is where the crime of the killing, it was kind of not planned. He didn't intend for the person to die, but they did. So there was no differences between the type of crime and psychopathy versus the control. So in other words, there weren't more psychopaths who had premeditated their crime or anything like that. The mean age at the time of their homicide was 28.9 years. The two groups did not differ on their age in general. And the two groups did not differ in terms of the amount of time since the homicide was committed. So, firstly, potential participants, so people who had volunteered, were asked whether they would be interested in taking part in a research study. So those who were interested underwent a psychopathic assessment in order to establish whether they were a psychopath or not, as we did not yet at this stage know if they were or weren't. So in measuring psychopathy, we used the psychopathic checklist, the revised version, so the PCLR. Now, this is 20 criteria, so 20 kind of questions, and it's scored from 0 to 2, and the maximum score is 40. So the clinical diagnostic cutoff point for psychopathy is scores of 30 or above. So if this was being used in a clinical sense, you would have to score 30 out of 40 in order to be classified as a psychopath. These PCLRs were given by people who were either extensively trained prison psychologists or a researcher who was trained in actually coding the PCLR. Okay, now they didn't use the cutoff point of 30, the clinical cutoff point. Instead, previous research had justified that when you are using a PCLR, you can actually use a cutoff point of 25. So that means that 14 of the volunteers were then classified as being psychopathic and 38 were not. So then they were interviewed. So participants were interviewed by 2 senior psychology graduates and a research student. Now these were all blind researchers in the sense of the fact that they were not aware whether the person that they were interviewing had been classified as a psychopath or not. So they did not know their psychopathy score. Now at the beginning of the interview, they were told that the purpose of the study was to examine the manner in which homicide offenders recall their homicide offence. Okay, so that's what the participants were told, and the procedure was verbally explained to them. So they interviewed them using that stepwise technique. They audio taped this as well. So participants were asked to describe their homicide offences in as much detail as possible from beginning to end and omit no details. Participants were prompted to do so using a standardised procedure known as the stepwise interview. So each of these interviews lasted around 25 minutes. Once these interviews were over, the narratives were then transcribed as close to verbatim, so as close to the words spoken as possible, and then checked to ensure spelling errors were corrected. All interviewer comments were deleted, so where they'd kind of prompt them for more information, that was deleted, and kind of proper nouns and abbreviations were spelled out. So if they'd kind of used an abbreviated word, that was actually put there in full. We then used 2 text analysis tools to analyse those transcripts. So I'm just going to give you some detail on each of those tools. So the first tool is the W matrix. So this is the Corpus speech analysis program. So by corpus, what we're talking about is the speech, the body of speech. So this program would bring together all of the interviews by the 14 psychopaths. So it would kind of input all of the information from those 14 psychopath interviews into the system and analyse them in a single comparison to the other 38. So all those 38 were kind of merged into one, and the 14 were merged into one, and a single comparison was done between the 2 bodies of text, basically. So they looked to basically tag parts of speech. So count how many nouns, adjectives, verbs were used, to analyse semantic concepts, and by semantic concepts we mean things like communication, social actions, evidence of time, stuff like that. And the extent of the difference was expressed as something known as a log likelihood ratio. The second technique that we used is the DAL, or Dictionary of Affect in Language. And this is another software program. So it's a dictionary-based tool which examines the affective tone of the words. This time, each transcript was analysed individually, and a score was given to each transcript that indicated pleasantness and intensity of emotional language. So in other words, it's a dictionary-based tool that would essentially look at the words used and how pleasant or intense they were in terms of their emotion present. So the general findings. Overall, there was no difference or significant difference in the average number of words used by the 2 groups. So the interviews of the psychopaths did appear to use more words, really, than the non-psychopaths. So there are your figures. But then when we average those out, the psychopaths used less per interview than the non-psychopaths. So actually there's not really any significant difference between those 2 groups. Now, we'll just run through findings in relation to the kind of the hypotheses that we had at the start. So first we were looking at the instrumental nature of the psychopaths and would that be reflected in their language use. So psychopaths appear to produce more subordinating conjunctions such as because, since, as, so, that. So these words are made up 1.82% of the overall words used, compared to 1.54% of word use by non-psychopaths. So this suggests that they had a motive behind their offences. So it seemed that they appeared to kind of justify their offences. They were meant to happen, they happened on purpose. So that kind of agrees with the hypothesis that Hancock laid out. The hierarchy of needs analysis. Okay, so here we are looking at the what needs are being fulfilled by the language that they're using. So psychopaths appeared to use approximately twice as many words related to basic physiological needs. Okay. So this included things like eating, drinking, monetary resources, things like that when they're describing their murders. So looking at the kind of overall percentage here, the controls in terms of food, there's only 0.12% of the words were related to food, whereas 0.3% of the words were related to food for the psychopaths, and so on. Almost double here in terms of drink. Again, not quite almost double, but quite a lot in terms of money. So controls use significantly more language related to social needs, so things like family and religion. Okay, so in terms of family, only 0.28% of the words that psychopaths used related to family, whereas 0.57% of the words that the controls used were related to family. So this suggests that psychopaths don't connect on an emotional level and are more concerned with the evolutionary basics of survival, as opposed to things like, like love and relationships and spirituality. Another finding in terms of the emotional expression, okay? So the degree to which the psychopaths had distanced themselves or were detaching themselves from the homicide that they had committed was examined through looking at the past and present forms of verbs used. So actually what we found here is that psychopaths use more past tense verbs than controls. Okay, so there we go. Past tense. So there would be things like gave or stabbed or killed, as opposed to kind of present tense verbs. So psychopaths use fewer present tense verbs than the controls. So that's what that row displays. So they're more likely to say, I stabbed him, as opposed to, so I'm like going to stab him. Okay, so when they're describing it, they're not describing it in a way where they're kind of putting themselves back into that situation to relive it and describe it as it's happening. They're describing it in order, but from a distant point in the future. Also, psychopaths produced a higher rate of articles than controls, revealing that their language involved more concrete nouns. So again, the guy rather than him, or a woman rather than she. So psychopathic language was significantly less fluent than controls as well. So it contained approximately 33% more disfluencies, so things like ums and ahs. Again, in terms of that emotional expression, so if you remember on the DAL, that was responsible for assigning a score for the emotional intensity and the pleasantness of that transcript. So they found on this DAL that there didn't appear to be any significant difference between the two groups in terms of one wasn't more emotionally intense or pleasant than the other. But when they analysed this again, they analysed it in a different way. So rather than using the overall PCLR score, they used the factor 1 score. So factor 1 is the part of the PCLR that assesses interpersonal and affective or emotional deficits. So they actually found that there was a negative correlation between the factor 1 score and the pleasantness and intensity of emotional language. So by taking that part of the PCLR that just looks at that emotional kind of expression, and then correlating that with the scores given, they actually found that the more kind of the higher your psychopathy score on emotionality, the less pleasantness was seen and the kind of less emotional intensity was seen in your transcript. So this suggests that the higher the interpersonal and affective deficit, the lower the pleasantness. So here's just a few examples of things that they said. So you might want to note some of these down. So for example, they said, I just turned and I looked at him and I stabbed him. Okay, so again, all of these are those past tense verbs there. Subordinating conjunctions. I said I have to do something because there is no way I want to end up losing all my life in prison. Again, referencing those basic needs. The money was excellent. We left to go get some more booze and more drugs. And again, this is those kind of basic needs and disfluencies. We got high and had a few beer. I like whiskey, so I bought some whiskey. We had some of that, and then we went for a swim. So overall, the conclusions that we can come to, there's quite a few. We can come to the conclusion that psychopaths are more likely than non-psychopaths to describe cause and effect relationships when describing their murder. So that's why they're using more kind of subordinating conjunctions. So this happened because this happened. Psychopaths are more likely to view their crime as a logical outcome of a plan than non-psychopaths. That again links to I did that because of this. Psychopaths focus more on physiological needs than higher level social needs. So that comes back to the basic need words that were chosen. And psychopaths are focused on a lower level of necessities in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs basically says that your basic physiological needs, such as kind of food, drink, things like that, come first. Then the next thing on the hierarchy is things like safety and so on and so forth, and it builds up towards things like love. So it's saying that actually the psychopaths will focus on those lower ends of the scale compared to non-psychopaths who would focus on potentially the higher ends. Psychopaths will linguistically frame their homicide as more in the past and more psychologically distant. So that is through them using more past tense verbs. Psychopaths give less emotionally intense descriptions of their crimes. Psychopath language is substantially more disfluent. Psychopaths describe powerful emotional events in an idiosyncratic manner. Using more of those kind of as there's instead. And psychopaths operate on a primitive but a rational level. So primitive in the sense of it's only the basic needs and the primitive needs that are satisfied, but they are very rational, and they look at this happened because this happened, and they see things in a logical sequence.